Today we're going to talk about how to create a particular type of one-shot that actually gets integrated into your overall campaign. It's something that I call a meanwhile. Let's get started. Hi everybody, thank you so much for being here. My name's Joe and welcome to Tabletop Theory, where we talk about educational theory, counseling theory, role-playing games, and all of those things working together to help make you a better storyteller. Today I wanted to talk about a particular type of one-shot that I've used over the years that I like to call a meanwhile. Now, what these are basically one-shots that integrate into your overall campaign that help to flesh out the story a little bit using pre-made characters. In a main campaign, most of the time that I've ever played big campaigns that have spanned for years, people generally play the same character every session. They go and they go and they go and they keep leveling these characters up and they keep gaining XP and they keep gaining new abilities. And every session you stick with the main characters. However, there are exceptions to this whenever I've actually wanted to flesh the story out to try to explain to the players, not their characters, what might be going on in another part of the world as a direct reaction to some of their characters' actions. The players use pre-made characters that you, the storyteller, have created for the purpose of playing through just this particular one-shot. It's one session. But since everything takes place in the same universe where your campaign is occurring, the actions that your players have basically undergone in the past can have an effect on how this meanwhile one-shot takes place, and the actions that your players go through during the meanwhile have an outcome of how your players might encounter some of this information later. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by a meanwhile. I wanted to give you an idea of how this type of one-shot can really be helpful for you as a storyteller if you want to move the game forward and your players don't necessarily know what's coming next, or you want to allude to something that's going to be happening in the next season of your campaign. Sorry, I organize my games into seasons, so different arcs are seasons of the campaign, and each play session I count as an episode. In an old Vampire the Masquerade game that I ran, the players were Camarilla, Camarilla, whatever you want to describe it as, whatever. They were the good vampires, right? And they had been working with the local sheriff to try to keep the city safe from a pack of Sabbat. Now, they had played together for one season of the show, and what I had chosen to do is that at the end of season 1, but before the start of season 2, I was going to run a meanwhile because my players already had a relationship with the sheriff of this particular city, Las Vegas, and they were going to be a lot more highly regarded in order to help fix some of the problems for the local prince. I know I'm not really making a lot of sense if you've never played Vampire, and if you have, I'm simplifying this a great deal, but bear with me. After the end of the first season, I created a small meanwhile for my players to play human drug dealers. They were basically a group of people that were just mortals that were dealing drugs all over Las Vegas. And what I wanted to do was to create a sense of foreboding for the second season of the campaign. So what ended up happening, players were stuck in a warehouse and they were basically waiting on some buyers to come for a bunch of drugs that they had. Then these dealers were attacked by a Sabbat pack. They were hunted down, and eventually all of those players' human characters were murdered by this Sabbat pack. Now, yes, that sounds incredibly cruel because they were basically engineered to lose. But the reason I did that is because at the start of the second season, I had my players get hired by the sheriff to go investigate a brutal murder of a bunch of human drug dealers that they believed that the Sabbat were responsible for, and they left a lot of very obvious signs that, hey, vampires killed a bunch of people, and the sheriff wanted the party to go deal with it. When the players eventually came in to do some investigation, there were things that they weren't aware of when they were playing the humans that they learned as they were playing their primary characters. Additionally, you started to see the players try to put pieces together without metagaming information, which admittedly is a challenge. And then on top of that, you had the players actually start to learn a little bit more about the world around them. They started to try to have some understanding of the Sabbat pack that their characters would have, but their players may not necessarily have had initially if they'd never played Vampire before. And I remember in that particular campaign, there were some players where this was their first Vampire game. That meanwhile gave them a sense of understanding the real brutality of a Sabbat pack without actually having to put their main characters in danger. Alternatively, I've run a Meanwhile in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign in the past where, again, between seasons, I had my players play a bunch of thieves/assassins breaking into a palace and stealing a sword. During the heist, a bunch of the one-shot characters were either captured or killed, but one player made it out with their one-shot character. They managed to steal the sword and get out of the palace. At the beginning of the second season, the first thing that happened was the players were contacted by this particular resistance movement that had tried to steal the magical sword that belonged to the Emperor, and the players were then tasked with trying to smuggle the sword out of the city. Now, if it had gone completely differently and that one player hadn't actually managed to complete the heist, then the players would have been contracted by the resistance to go and steal the sword themselves. But since the players were already successful in the theft of the item, that changed the mission for the beginning of the second season. So you can kind of see how these Meanwhiles give you the opportunity to be a little bit flexible with the different types of twists and turns that your campaigns can take in order to help your players feel a lot more invested in the general progression of the world that they're playing in. So I know that sounds kind of like really convoluted, but let me break it down real quick to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So when you're at a stopping point in your campaign, or when you're between two big plot arcs, or when you're kind of out of combat and you want to give your players some kind of larger explanation about what's going on in the world and maybe how their actions have changed the world, that's the perfect time for a Meanwhile. The most important part of a Meanwhile is to further a particular chunk of story that doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation to the players immediately. This is something that they're going to find out about later and have knowledge as players to be like, oh yeah, I remember when your players get a much greater sense of the environment that they're playing in when they can experience it from different points of view of different characters that are happening in different parts of the world. It's also important that whatever Meanwhile you're creating is going to take place in a part of the world that your players are already a little bit familiar with. So if they're in place A, but they've visited place B, but they're not there right now, have the Meanwhile take place in place B. The characters that you're going to be handing out to your players usually have some kind of predetermined association. Maybe they're all in their own adventuring party, maybe they're part of a specific religious order, maybe they just like each other and they're friends. It doesn't matter what the association is, as long as it works for the type of story that you're wanting to tell. They can be extremely high level, much more powerful than the characters that your players are usually playing, or they can be much lower level and less powerful than the characters that your players are usually playing. Or, and this is my favorite, create a mix. I really like mixed level parties, and this really kind of supposes that you're playing an RPG that utilizes a level-based system, but it doesn't necessarily have to, because there's plenty of role-playing games out there that use just a straight XP system that don't use levels at all. So maybe you have some characters that are a lot more experienced and a lot more powerful, or some characters that are a lot less powerful with a lot less XP baked into them. You don't necessarily even have to use pre-made characters. You can have your players make characters for the one-shot, and if you choose to do that, try to give them really specific instructions about exactly what type of characters that they need to make. So if they need to make an assassin that has a certain amount of power, you have to walk them through the process of creating a character that works just for this one shot. Because if you don't have characters that make sense to work together for a Meanwhile, then it's kind of just creating another campaign, and that's not the point of a Meanwhile. You want to move the world forward without having your players create characters that they want to leave the main campaign for. The other benefit of using something like a pre-made character, or having your players create characters that they intend to use just for the one-shot, is that if they get killed, it's no big deal, nobody cares. If it's a one-shot character that you made for them, then most of the time I've seen my players play those types of characters with complete disregard for personal safety. The important thing to remember is that the outcome of a Meanwhile affects the larger game world. It's also really helpful because it helps your players to feel like their actions shape the world around them, because for me as a player, that's always a really fun part of a role-playing game for me. If my characters actually can change the world that they're playing in, then I feel like it's a much more rewarding experience for me as a player. And as a storyteller, I really love that, because if the players do something that I completely don't expect, and I have to completely change around something about the world that will have lasting consequences, then I feel like like the world itself becomes a more rich environment for me to run a story in. So that's all I've got for you today. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I feel like it's a neat idea that I haven't heard of other people doing, but I bet I'm not the only one that does this. I'd really like to know what you do if you have one-shot ideas that you integrate into your campaign. Do they function like the meanwhiles that I just talked about, or do you use them a different way? Or maybe you have an entire campaign that's nothing but one-shots, which I think is a really interesting idea. I've never done that, but I would really like to know if you have. If you've done anything like that, let me know down here in the comments section or on Instagram or Twitter. I am so interested in how different people use one-shots, because I feel like in a lot of cases one-shots are kind of just this throwaway idea that everybody's just like, oh yeah, I don't really have time to run a campaign, but meanwhile gives you the opportunity to stretch your world, give your players something interesting to do that forebodes to new things that can happen in their campaigns, but also is just something fun to let you flex different storytelling muscles that maybe you haven't had a chance to break out in a long time. The words "I'm sorry," that phrase gets uttered a lot by me. And the reason that's the case is because of some self-confidence issues I had when I was growing up. And I used to say it all the time. If I was late for something, I'm sorry. If I'm showing up on time for something, I'm sorry. If I'm getting something out of the fridge, I'm sorry. And the reason that I did that is because when I was younger, it was a big lack of self-confidence that came from me. But as I've gone through the years, one intervention that I think that's been really helpful for me and other friends of mine that have similar kinds of impulses is the idea of taking "I'm sorry" and turning it into "thank you." And let me explain. The idea behind changing "I'm sorry" to "thank you" is to help pivot your mind and to start feeling less down on yourself and feeling less defensive in situations where you might have felt uncomfortable in the past. Now, this isn't a catch-all. This doesn't necessarily mean that you need to stop saying "I'm sorry" altogether, or you need to say "thank you" all the time when you really don't mean it. That's not what this is for. The idea is to help yourself feel like you can roll back some of those impulsive, defensive "I'm sorries" into something that might make yourself feel a little bit more confident in your actions, as well as helping you to tell other people around you how grateful you feel when that's actually what you mean, instead of saying "I'm sorry" where you feel like you need to apologize every 5 seconds because that's just your default mode. Taking "I'm sorry" and turning it into "thank you" changes your feeling of one of trying to defend yourself into one of gratitude. Instead of "I'm sorry I haven't folded laundry, thanks for giving me the time to do that." Or instead of "I'm sorry I came into the room, hey, how are you? Thanks for being here." It's a reflexive thing to say "I'm sorry" for some people, and it was for me, but over the years, I've found that changing the words "I'm sorry" to "thank you" have helped to change my attitude from one of defensiveness to one of gratitude. And I'm wondering if something like that could be helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, be kind, and have fun adventuring.